Welcome to the Unified Brand Podcast, brought to you by Elements Brand Management, a weekly brand building and brand strategy podcast to help you unlock your brand's potential, stand out from the competition, and create impact. Today, we're joined by Jamie Dixon, a coach, trainer, and author of the books Overcome and Get It Done, Shaping Paths, and his new book, The Story Habit, and instructor of the online course, Train the Trainer. Great to have you on the Unified Brand Podcast, Jamie. It'd be good to learn a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris. And so I work as a leadership development coach and trainer, and I'm based in China. And so a big focus of my work is working with a lot of Chinese and Asian leaders in multinational companies and helping them to better influence their stakeholders back in headquarters overseas. And so this is kind of what's led me into writing the book, The Story Habit, because some of the biggest challenges they face, particularly in China, the stories that their stakeholders overseas believe about China, about things like human rights abuses and intellectual property theft. And because they believe in those stories, it can be very, very hard to change their minds sometimes and get them to see a reality that's a bit different. So I work with a lot of leaders who face these kinds of challenges, and I help them to better influence their stakeholders overseas.
Cool. And do you find with sort of Chinese and the Asian sort of market with regards to traditions, the traditions play into storytelling into companies and the kind of the history of the country and stuff like that? Does it play into storytelling and some of the mythology maybe surrounding some of those things? Does that play into the work that you do? And does that have an impact on how you deal with the clients that you work with?
You know, interestingly, in China in particular, I think there's actually a big issue with storytelling because they have remarkable hard power and infrastructure and incredible technology. But for some reason, they've completely abandoned the ability to tell stories. And you're a branding expert, so I'm sure you know value is purely story. It's not the hardware. And I think a fantastic example is the company Huawei. They are the pioneers of 5G technology. They had incredible technology to offer the world, but the world doesn't want it, or at least the Western world doesn't want it because of the stories that they believe about Huawei. And those stories are starting to cause really big problems for China. So regards mythology and ancient philosophies and so on, I don't see that so much of an influence, but more the recent speed of economic development causing people to just be overly focused on the hardware and completely forget about the story. And it's only in the last 2-3 years since Trump and the pandemic that lack of story is really starting to hurt China at the moment. And I think it's a very, very big weakness for the country going forward.
Yeah, that mythology thing, I was thinking, because just when you said that, I thought from a point of view of like, you think of the storytelling of kind of, and the traditions and the history of some of like Japan and China, you think of the mythology as well and that kind of, and I just wondered whether it's interesting that the storytelling's kind of been lost because you think of it as a key thing to the culture almost.
Yeah, it's been completely lost. I guess they will rediscover it pretty soon.
So what mistakes do business leaders make when it comes to storytelling?
I think when it comes to storytelling, one of the biggest mistakes is forgetting that a story is not about you. It's about the audience. And a really important principle of storytelling is that you have to relate to the audience. If you look at any story, and I think Disney is a fantastic example of this, Disney is such a successful company because they do such a great job of relating to their audience. Frozen, the movie Frozen was one of the most successful movies of all time. It made like $1.2 billion. And the reason is because it related to their audience of preschoolers and created this fantasy land with these uncontrollable emotions that preschoolers can relate to so well. And with a lot of leaders, what I see is a lack of empathy and forgetting to think about other people's perspectives and what other people care about, what other people think about this issue, and what other people understand. And so if you don't have that empathy, it can be really, really difficult to be a good storyteller because a fundamental part of storytelling is relating. So I think that lack of relating to people is probably the biggest mistake I see in leaders with storytelling.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got two young daughters who love Frozen. Yeah, they just fully invested in that. They love that story. And the second one, it's made for them. Like you said, it's relates to them. So what are the most common misconceptions then do you see around storytelling and business?
I had this misconception as well before I ventured off into writing The Story Habit. I think the traditional understanding of storytelling, when you hear this word, you think of a charismatic speaker standing on stage telling a story and people getting a round of applause, or you think of Hollywood movies, or you think of fantasy novels like Game of Thrones. And yes, they're all story, but there is a much broader scope of story as well. And I think the most powerful definition of story is the stories that people believe in, that we use to navigate our way around the world. And the example I gave earlier, you have these Chinese leaders who are on the ground in China. They're seeing everything that's happening in China. They're seeing the market. They're seeing the regulations changing. They're seeing what the consumers need. And they go to their leaders and they tell them, this is what we need to do to adapt to the China market. But their leaders have this story that they believe that stops them taking action. And a really specific example of that is a company I worked with a few years ago who they sold coffee machines. And in China, if you want to sell a consumer product, you should be selling on the e-commerce platform Tmall, which is like Amazon, but in China. And when the leadership team here in China went to their Swiss headquarters and said, we need to set up a store on Tmall, the Swiss headquarters said, no, we don't. We have a website. And so if people want to buy our coffee machines, they can go on our website. The reality is in China, nobody uses websites anymore. Everything is done on apps, especially WeChat apps. And they had a really, really hard time overcoming that story that their leaders believed in. So I think the misconception with storytelling is that it's just about telling stories. Actually about so much more than that. It's about shaping the stories that people believe in.
That's interesting. So if it's about belief, because you find that with the stories we tell ourselves about each other, who we are, what, like you said, what we believe and that kind of thing. How intrinsic is it to, when you're working with a client, to uncover the stories that they already believe? And how do you help to shape those stories into the new direction of where you want to take them or what they want to become?
There's a framework I talk about in my book called Relate, Challenge, Resolve. And the reason I love this framework is because it works exactly the same way for telling stories as it does for shaping the stories that people believe in. And I think that really shows the parallel between how stories work and how the mind works. And so Relate, Challenge, Resolve starts with relating, which I mentioned earlier. Any story has to start by presenting a character in a situation the audience can relate to. Because if they can't relate to it, they won't get immersed in the story, they won't be able to follow it, and so on. And then as we, my favorite example is, Disney movies, Simba in The Lion King. Yes, he's a lion, I'm not a lion, but he's a child, and I used to be a child, and I know what it's like to want to be free, but have parents tell me what to do all the time and have a close relationship with my parents and so on. And so that's the relate part. And then as the audience relate to the character, they get sucked in, they immerse themselves, and then something happens to the character. They meet a challenge, their world changes and they meet a challenge. Simba's father dies and he has to go off into the jungle. And so then in the end, the resolve, the resolution, how do they overcome the challenge? What actions do they take to achieve their goals? And so that's how it works for telling stories, but it works exactly the same way for when you want to shape stories people believe in. So a lot of the time when we're trying to persuade and influence and change people's minds, a lot of the time our natural habit is to just go straight to challenge. And if I go back to that coffee machine example, challenge them and say, no one uses websites in China. But if you go straight to challenge, you are most likely to meet resistance. So what you have to do is start by relating and start by basically saying things that make them nod their heads. They can nod their heads, you are relating to them. So you want to say things that reflect their concerns, their pain points, their current beliefs, and their understanding of the situation. You want to get into their story and show them that you understand their story. And yes, I understand we have a website, and I can totally see how that website gives us more control over the brand. And I can see your concerns about counterfeit items being sold on Tmall and not wanting to be associated with that. Once you've done enough relating, then you can go into challenging. And that is when you start to point out how their current stories are not serving them and how this better story would serve them better. And point out that, in China, nobody uses websites, and 98%, or whatever, I'm plucking a number out of thin air, but it's probably something like this, 98% of online purchases are made through Tmall, and nobody uses websites. And presenting facts, statistics, whatever, anything that can challenge their current belief. And if you've done a good enough job of relating already, they're much more likely to change their mind at that point and go with you. And then finally is the resolve part, because just because you've changed their mind doesn't mean they're necessarily ready for action. They need an action plan. And specifically, they need a first next step, something risk-free where the cost-benefit ratio is completely optimized for them. And they may as well just take that next step. And so, that next step with that team I worked with was just to try selling one of their coffee machines on Tmall through a distributor and see what happens. And they were amazed at what happened. And then that led to them being more willing to take the next step, and so on and so on. That's how it works. It works equally for telling stories and for shaping the stories that people believe in as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I suppose you can use that from a cultural point of view in terms of your internal company culture with your team. If you're delivering messages to your team and you're trying to shape that culture through the values of the company, you could equally do that through those 3 steps.
Yeah. And I think, so for example, to go a bit deeper into relate is it's not just understanding their stories. It's also presenting your story in a way that they can relate to. And one really simple and powerful way of doing that is the classic storytelling principle of show, don't tell. Stop saying that our company culture is customer first. Stop telling it. Start showing them how that actually works in real life. And the reason show, don't tell works so well is because our intellect is in our head and our senses are connected to the outside world. Anything that makes it into our intellect does so through our senses. And you can look at young children who are just learning to speak to see exactly how this works. They see a dog, they hear their mom and dad say, look at the dog. The next time they hear the word dog, they're associating that word with the image in their mind of that dog they saw earlier. The mind can only understand what the senses have experienced. And so if you are trying to convince people that your culture is a particular way, we are customer focused, shut up and let them experience it. Stop telling them, let them experience it, let them see it for themselves. And so a really good exercise for leaders to do is to think of, this is the story we want people to believe in. How can we let people experience that story? Because when they can experience that in real life, that's when it starts to go into their minds. And so that's the most powerful thing about relating. When you can actually ground things in the sensory world, then they are much more likely to buy into it and much more likely to follow you. And the challenge and resolve parts may not even be necessary if you do a good enough job of letting them experience that.
Really interesting. I do a thing where I try and explain the way that brands work in a similar kind of way. So you relate your experience, you relate the name to the brand, you relate the visual to the brand, you relate that experience to the brand. But you have to have this thing initially that creates almost like a container to put that in. It's kind of this, like you were saying about the difference between a dog and then someone understanding what the name for the dog is and what the representation of that is. I think brands work very similarly to that. And do you find that storytelling through the brand is done in a similar way and it's interacted with the target audience in a similar way? Do they engage in it through those three sort of steps?
I definitely think that the experience part is really critical. Let me go into a little bit more detail. The experience part is really critical because they need to see it for themselves. They need to experience it for themselves, and then they will feel it. And then, any Airbnb, I think, is a good example of a company with a really, really good company brand. You go and stay in Airbnb, you just go on their website, and my feeling when I go on the Airbnb website is just hope. Although I haven't been able to go on that website for a few years now because I've been stuck in China. And then you go and stay in someone's home. I remember I went on a business trip in Tokyo and I stayed in someone's home there. And it's just so different. It's so cool and really immerses you in the local culture. That's the experience part, the relate part. And the challenge part, perhaps that's about letting people experience things that are different experiences to what they would get through other brands. If I stayed in a 5-star hotel like the Marriott, for example, I'd get a lovely breakfast buffet. I get a really, really nice hotel room with bubble bath and so on. But I wouldn't get that local cultural immersion. So one thing about challenge is contrast. When you can contrast your idea with something else, then they start to buy into your story a bit more. Because one other principle of storytelling is that a story is always about change. If you can show a change, that gives birth to the story. And if you're used to always staying in 5-star hotels, having breakfast buffets, and then one day your favorite hotel is fully booked and I'm gonna have to try Airbnb. And then you go there and it's such a different experience. You can't help but notice and create a story about that. And then the final part is resolve. This is something I think a lot of leadership teams can learn really, really well from brands because resolve is all about getting people to take action. And a really, really good example is if you go on the sales page of any online service, Netflix, Dropbox, they make it very, very clear exactly the action you need to take. They maximize the benefits for you and they minimize the effort for you. All you need to do is click this one little button and you get all of these amazing benefits. And not only that, but they also give you an escape option. There's no risk because if you click this button and you don't like it, you can get a refund. You can get a refund within 7 days, or you can cancel whenever you want. And so there's some principles in action there that are shaping the stories people have about the action you want them to take. Is it safe? Is it worth it? And I think this is something leaders can learn a lot from brands, especially brands that sell online services. I guess that's how relate, challenge, resolve works for branding.
With the book, what was the inspiration for the book? Why did you write it? What is the book about as a whole? And who's it really for?
I'll start with the last question there. I've written that book specifically for leaders. And the goal is to help them bring more meaning to everyday conversations. And the reason I wrote it was because I work as a trainer in the leadership development field, and storytelling, it was a really hot topic and still is a really hot topic. And, about 7 years ago, I started getting asked for storytelling trainings. And I really didn't understand why, because I didn't understand what people really meant by storytelling. And so a client would come to me and they'd ask, we'd like storytelling training. And I'd ask them, why? What for? And they tell me, well, we have these engineers and they're terrible at giving monthly reports. They just send people to sleep. So we want them to learn storytelling. And I went off and researched storytelling and I came across the hero's journey. And for those of you who don't know what the hero's journey is, it's a framework where it starts off with a normal person, meets an incredible challenge. Somehow they overcome the challenge and then they become a hero in the end. And there's like 12 different steps to this framework. And as I was looking at this, and I was looking at a lot of other storytelling courses on the market that use this exact framework, I was thinking, this really overcomplicates things. I don't want these engineers taking their monthly reports and turning them into a story about a hero and then just sending their leaders crazy. There's no need to overcomplicate things. So I got really curious about, why is storytelling so popular and what do we mean by storytelling? And that set me off on my own research into the subject and research into just a lot of different questions, such as what is the meaning of meaning? And that led me to a whole load of different places and some really, really great books that I read as well. The Patterning Instinct by Jeremy Lent is one I really, really found very insightful, and How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and The Science of Storytelling by William Storr. Those books really, really changed my thinking about storytelling and made me realize that it's about the beliefs. It's about the stories that shape people's minds and shape people's beliefs ultimately. And I wanted to see how I could equip leaders with simple skills they can use in daily situations to help them start shaping those beliefs, those stories that are shaping people's beliefs. I wanted to see how I could help them shape those. That's kind of where the story habit came from.
Cool. So with the story habit, is there anything from that you could share a little bit now, obviously with the framework we've shared, but is there anything you could some tips and things you could give the listeners to look out for and think about when they come across a situation where they need to use a story?
Yeah. So I call it the story habit because relate, challenge, resolve, each one of those are individual skills. And the easiest way to develop any skill is to start with habits, because habits are minimal effort and they grow the skill naturally from there. So my favorite story habit, or maybe not my favorite, but the very first story habit, and one of my favorites, is the habit of noticing change. This is the easiest way to develop the skill of actually telling stories. And noticing change is basically this. Any story is always about a change. It's never about, I got on the subway, I went to work, did my work, came home, went to bed. It's never about life as normal. It's always about, I got on the subway and then the subway derailed and I had to walk 4 miles across a track and I got picked up by a helicopter and so on. It's always about something completely unusual or some kind of change. And so the best places to find stories are any kind of changes that you experience in your life. And you experience change every single day. And so if you want to have a lot of stories to tell, all you need to do is start noticing these little changes that happen every single day. And when you notice these changes, they go into your memory bank, into your story pool, which is in your memory bank. And you have all of these little experiences of change, which you start storing in your story pool. And then the next time you're in a situation where maybe you're just having a chat with someone, maybe you're trying to explain something, or you're trying to teach someone something, and it would be really, really handy to have a story or an example to pull out at that moment. You can reach into your story pool and you can tell that instance of change that you stored in your story pool. And the very first time you do this story, it will be terrible. The very first time you tell a story is never the best time. The best stories you've ever heard have been told countless times before. And I'm reminded of, there's a YouTube video of Jamie Foxx, the actor Jamie Foxx, telling a story about Mike Tyson. And the video is really interesting because he starts telling the story on, I think, like the Jimmy Kimmel show. And then halfway through, it suddenly switches to him telling the story on another show. And it's as if it's exactly the same story, because it is exactly the same story being told in exactly the same way. And he's told this story so many times before. And it's only through telling the story and getting feedback and refining it that you make the story really, really great. So the easiest way to develop the skill of telling stories, just to notice the little changes that happen in your life, store them in your story pool. Next opportunity you get, take it out and see what's wrong with it, what can be improved with it, and just refine it from there. And there's one little exercise I give people when I'm running workshops, We normally finish on the first day and come back on the second day. And I say, I want to hear, what's your evening story? What crazy things happened this evening? I want to hear your stories tomorrow morning. You'll all find a story to tell. And some of those stories are really rubbish. Some of those stories are really, really bizarre. And some are really, really good. And it all comes from just noticing the little changes. So I think that's a really simple one that people can take away. Simple habit people can take away. And one of my favorites from the story habit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm part of a networking group that meets weekly, and we have like 60 seconds each week to present our business, talk about our business, what we do, how we can help, who we're looking for. And in the car on the way to the networking meeting, I will think about what I'm going to say. I would have thought about it the night before, and I'll have an idea, and then I repeat it in the car. I kind of go over it. And the best ones I've done have always been the ones that are telling a story. They've always got the best results. They've always got more people engaged. There's an aha moment because what I try and do with the story is I take them on a bit of a journey, and then I segue into from what the story was as something in my life, and segue into how that relates to what I do in business and what we do as an agency in business and the client journey. And it's amazing how much of a different response the storytelling 60 seconds have to just telling something, and how much people remember those as well. It's a really stark difference. You talk about the memory, the story pool, but also is there an equally less effect on the person you're talking to?
There's two main reasons that come to mind at the moment. One is the emotion part of a story. So as you go through the change in your story, there is going to be some emotional fluctuation. And normally at the beginning of the story, we're introduced to the character and their situation, and it's all normal, all something the audience can relate to. And, yeah, I've been there before. I get that. And we're getting people relaxed and getting them up to an emotional high. And then suddenly my dog got hit by a car, or I fell down a manhole, or something crazy like that. And the emotion becomes completely the opposite. Again, it's change, and it's that contrast. But emotional contrast in particular is basically super glue for memory. And the reason that works is because if you go back to our hunter-gatherer context that our current brains are mostly suited for and have evolved for, imagine going out one day hunting with your friend, and then all of a sudden you hear behind you a massive roar, and then chomp. And then you look behind you and you can only see your friend's leg and a lion running off in the distance. In that moment, you're going to be really emotional. You're going to be shocked. And that's because in that moment, you need to be emotional, because you need to remember every single instance of that, every single detail. Because the next time you see a lion, you need to remember what that lion did before. Otherwise, you're going to die. And so that emotion is basically a survival instinct. And stories trigger that by having this little emotional contrast within it. So that's one reason that the stories make things really easy to remember. And another reason is when you are telling the story, you're most likely using a lot of vivid language. And this is also show, don't tell. So instead of telling people, I crashed my car, you would show them by saying, I was driving, and then all of a sudden, boom, and my head went through the windshield. And now I don't need to tell you I crashed my car. You've got the pictures in your mind to let you know what that is. And those pictures will be so easy to remember, because again, that's talking to the senses and not the intellect. The intellect doesn't really remember details so well, but the senses, they remember the details so well. So if you want your storytelling to really help people remember, you need to have that emotional contrast and also those really, really vivid details. And then people will be able to take it away and remember it very clearly.
Is there any sort of tips you have on emotional contrast, how to establish that or develop it or find it in a particular story and enhance it in any way? Is there anything you can do with that with regards to emotional contrast?
So I think the principle, the ultimate principle around this change in a story is that we want to learn what stories the characters in the story believe in. and they have their story that they're using to navigate their world. And then the world changes and their story hasn't kept up with it. I'll just make up an example. This afternoon, I was doing a workshop, and I do my workshops virtually. I sit on my balcony in Shanghai. So I went to get my coffee, tested my technology, was all ready to sit down and do my workshop, load up Zoom, and welcome everyone, run the icebreakers, all calm, all ready to go. And then all of a sudden, upstairs, they started going, and they started doing their renovation works. And I couldn't hear anything. And now I'm in a situation that the story I'm using of I'm ready to do my workshop completely leaves me lost. And so if you can really show how lost the character is in that moment, that is where the emotional contrast can become really, really strong. You want to let the audience get a really good feel for what do they believe in, what drives them, what makes their behavior easy to predict for me, and then change the world so that everything they operate by no longer works. It's like taking someone from using a MacBook to a Windows XP computer. It should be that kind of experience. I think that's how you can really, really strengthen the emotional contrast. Put the character in a situation where they are completely lost and completely hopeless, and then the audience will really feel that pain.
That's how magicians get their, from the illusionist side of things. They put you into a state where you, especially with their hand movements and things like that, where you think the rabbit's going to come out of somewhere, or the flower's going to come out somewhere else, or the card's going to be in the stack, and it's not. And because your brain kind of predicts, especially I've seen one with a magician throwing a ball in the air and then it disappears. He does it a few times beforehand. So you track the ball so you can see the fact that the ball's in the same place and then it goes. And it's in that moment that you have this wow factor of, oh, right, okay, everything's shifted now, everything's changed. It's not where I expected. And I can get in the sense from what you said there, and I got it when you said that story. There's a similar kind of shift going on. There's a similar kind of change and unpredictability about it that is almost a delight in a way, in kind of, even if it's an emotional story, there's something about that change that seems really magnetic.
And that word predictability is really fundamental. This is a fundamental way of how our brains work. And there's a theory called simulation. And this is something Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about in her book, How Emotions Are Made. And she basically says that we don't experience reality as it is. We simulate reality, because reality is an overwhelming mass of noise that our brains could never comprehend. Our brains try to find patterns in the noise to help us navigate it. And if I give an example, if I say the sounds, e, o, e, e, that's just noise. It means absolutely nothing to you. But now, if I input the pattern, we see stories everywhere. The next time you hear e, o, e, your brain hears something familiar and finds it has a pattern that matches that. And then it overloads the layers over that pattern that it has. And so actually, a lot of what we experience is not reality. It's our brain taking a mold of a pattern it has that matches really, really closely with the incoming sensory information, and it just layers that over. And so 2 examples of this that we experience every single day. One is you walk into a room and you swear you see someone there, but it's just a coat on an armchair. Your brain has simulated reality. And another is even when you're just walking along and you've got a song playing in your head, that's also your brain simulating reality. It's playing that over the actual noise that's coming in from the world. And so our brains work by predicting what's coming next. I've got this little bit of data that matches this data in my brain. So I'm just going to overlay that pattern instead, and we can just keep going as per usual. And so there's several implications of this. One is you were mentioning about that element of surprise and joy that you get. When something doesn't match your expectations, it either exceeds your expectations, and that's joy and surprise, or it goes below your expectations. I remember I once went to a Chinese bakery when I lived in a city in the south of China about 15 years ago. And I went to buy Danish pastry, and it had this custard with an apricot on top. I went to take a bite. I discovered it was actually a boiled egg.
Oh, wow.
It was a horrific experience. And that's the opposite of joy. It mismatched with what I'd expect and far less pleasant than what I was expecting. But one further implication of this predictability is around trust. This is one of the really important things in the story habit for leaders. My definition of trust is the belief that I can predict whether you will help or at least not hurt me. As a trust is all about predictability. If I can predict what you're going to do, when I first came to Shanghai, there were quite a lot of pickpockets around. And sometimes I'd go in the subway station and I'd see exactly the same pickpocket. And I'd seen them pickpocket people before. I trusted exactly what they were going to do. I could predict their behavior. But that's actually not trust, because I know they're not going to help me. They're going to hurt me. So actually being able to help people and prove to people and cause people to believe they can predict that you will help them is really how you build trust. An example is in Shanghai, there are a lot of these financial advisors. They think every single expat in Shanghai is a millionaire and has loads of money to invest. So somehow your mobile number will end up on their list and they'll give you a call and say, hello, Mr. Dixon, and blah, blah, blah. And I've been for a few meetings with some of these in the past, never invested anything. But I remember one meeting I went to, and they were telling me about this investment plan. They said, this is the perfect plan for you. And afterwards, I asked him, that's great, but I really want to know what's in it for you. Why do you want me to invest in this? How does this benefit you? And he just said, I just want to help people. I thought, no. But I went to another one a few years later and I asked exactly the same question. He said, okay, that's a fair question. And let me show you. This is our compensation structure. And as you can see, it doesn't matter which plan you invest in, this is how we get compensated. We get compensated exactly the same way, regardless of which plan you invest in. I'm going to trust that person a lot more because I know their intentions. When I know their intentions, I can predict what they're going to do. And I can find it a lot easier to predict that they're going to help me and not hurt me. And so that's how you build trust. So that predictability is a really fundamental part of storytelling and something magicians have a lot of fun with as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's a really fundamental thing for business leadership, building that trust throughout your team, throughout your organization, and also with the target audience and the public.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I was running a workshop a few years ago. When I turned up to the workshop, the HR suddenly came to me and said, Jamie, really sorry, but we're going to have to delay the workshop by about an hour and a half because we've got this really important company announcement. And basically, it was the US headquarters having a meeting, online conference call with the China team saying, we've just acquired another company in China. And why they acquired that company, they did not say. And because they did not say, they left this gap of guessing. I was watching it in that room. They were on mute, but they were all gossiping and saying, oh, they don't trust us anymore. They've acquired that company because they don't think we can do this anymore. And actually, shortly after that, a lot of people left that company. And so making your actions, especially the leadership team's actions, as predictable as possible is really how you build trust. If you're going to go through a massive organizational change, you want to help people predict exactly what's going to happen. Because when they can't predict, that creates a gap, the gap of gossip. And that's where trust completely breaks down. So make things as predictable as possible, and then people will trust you.
So have you seen any companies recently that you think have really sort of nailed their sort of leadership storytelling and getting that trust aspect sort of bang on? It can be, obviously be a client or just a brand that you've seen locally or globally.
There's one company in particular that really impressed me with their culture. And that company is actually Tencent, which outside of China, some people will have heard of Tencent, a very, very big company. They're a Chinese high-tech company. They make software. They've made WeChat, QQ, and they're also, I believe, the video game Fortnite or PUBG, one of those games I believe they make, although don't quote me on that. So they're a massive high-tech company. And Chinese high-tech companies, Alibaba, for example, I've actually been to Alibaba's offices, and to be very honest, I wasn't impressed with their culture. Having people sleep on stretcher beds out in the hallway, not a good impression. When I went there, people were burnt out, they were stressed, feeling pressured. But when I went to Tencent, people were just smiling everywhere. I was standing in the training room, looking out in the window over the corridors, and people were just having a good time. They were having fun, they were taking photos, they were chatting with each other. The people in the room with me were unbelievably smart, way, way smarter than I could ever be. And there's just something that they've done that their culture is just really, really good. And I was actually asking the HR there, how is their culture so good? I really didn't expect this from a Chinese high-tech company. And they said, remember what product we've made? We've made WeChat. And for people outside of China, you might not know WeChat, but it's the equivalent of WhatsApp, but so much more than WhatsApp. And it has so many different functions. In China, people basically live their lives on WeChat. There's many apps within WeChat. You can pay using WeChat. You can find a new boyfriend or girlfriend using WeChat, find a job. You can watch videos. You can do everything on WeChat. And that's because they really understand how people work. They spend a lot of time relating to their users, trying to learn exactly what their users value, what they're looking for in life, what would make things easier for them. And they took that exact same expertise and applied it to their management and leadership. And I'm sure they're not perfect. I'm sure there's a lot of burnt out and stressed out people there as well. But the ones I met really, really enjoyed working there by the sounds of it. And seems to be because the leadership team really understand people. And there was one other thing that they do, which I was really impressed with, was they actually demote people. In most companies I've been to, they only promote. But in that company, if you're not doing a good enough job, sorry, you go down. And so people really have an incentive to keep doing a better job. So they really understand people and how people work. And I think that's something a lot of high-tech companies don't get, in my experience, because they're technical. They're very good with the technical side of things, but completely forget about the people side of things. So Tencent really impressed me.
Cool. Well, thank you. And I just want to say thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find out a bit more about yourself, the Story Habit, and find you online on other social sort of platforms?
And thank you for having me as well. I've enjoyed the chat. And easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn. Just search Jamie Dixon, Dixon, and you'll see my face on an orange background. Or you can visit my website, Shaping Paths, all one word, shapingpaths.com. And you can see more about what I do there.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thanks for coming on. I'll put the links in the show notes to all of your website, to LinkedIn, and also to the book as well. So thank you very much. It's been awesome. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We've just put together a weekly brand tip video series, which is designed to help you to unlock your brand's potential, and stand out from the competition. And if you're interested, if you just go to elementsbrandmanagement, all one word, .co.uk/weekly-brand-tips, sign up and you'll be delivered a 3 to 5 minute video a week straight to your inbox. I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to receive more, you can subscribe in all the usual places. We're talking iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. Please, if you get a chance, rate and review. It helps the podcast to kind of get a bit more visibility and allows us to keep on producing these podcasts. Have a great week. Catch up soon. Keep those brands unified.